Hi, so in this video we're going to cover some of the information that you will need to know for the quadratic formula and its use. So the quadratic formula is used for quadratic equations. So a graph that is a parabola is a quadratic function. In other words, it has the highest value of 2, so it's squared. So the generic formula for any quadratic graph or equation is going to be found in the generic formula, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And just remember, these coefficients, a, b, and c, are going to be useful in utilizing the quadratic formula. So what's the purpose of the quadratic formula? The purpose of the quadratic formula is to easily find and to get the values for the roots of the equation. The roots are basically the points where the graph intersects the x-axis. They're also called the zeros because that's when y is equal to 0. And these roots have many different applications in life and in math especially. But for now, we'll get into those. We're just going to find its use in your geometry class. So going back to these different coefficients of x, so these coefficients are going to be used in the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula can be derived from this equation. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but it's something that is important to know, maybe for a test or quiz. But in essence, the quadratic formula is found with this equation. So the x value of the root, or the 0, is, so that x value is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. There's a song, I'll sing it for you. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so with this equation, there are a couple questions that arise. Firstly, why the plus or minus? So in a quadratic equation or graph, we're going to have two roots, or we might have one or we might have 0. So there's a root that is to the right of the vertex potentially, so a certain value to the right of the vertex, and there's also a root to the left of the vertex, so plus a certain value to the right of the x on the x-axis and minus a certain value to the left on the x-axis. Also, the square root term right here, we call that the discriminant. The discriminant is used in determining whether you can factor out an equation. More information to follow on that. But let's get to what you're probably going to look for in most applications in your geometry class. So a common question will be find the roots. So again, we said that the roots were in an equation. It's when the y value is equal to 0, it's the x-intercepts. So we're going to use the quadratic formula for this. We need to find the x value when the y value is equal to 0. So since the y value must be equal to 0, y is going to be equal to 0, and we're going to use the quadratic formula. So before we can use our quadratic formula, which is up here, we need to know what our a value, our b value, and c values are. So for this one, it's kind of simple to see that a is equal to, what's the coefficient acting upon the x squared value? That's going to be 1. The coefficient acting on the x term is also 1, so b is equal to 1. And the value for c, acting upon the x to the 0 power, no x, is equal to negative 2. So c equals negative 2. So now let's use our quadratic formula. Let's sing it out. X equals negative b, so negative of whatever b is, b plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 1 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 2, and that all over 2 times whatever a is. So then, using our amazing simplification skills, we know that x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 squared minus 4 times negative 2 is positive 8, so 1 plus 8, which is going to be 9, and then divided by 2 times 1, which is 2. So x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus root 9. We know that root 9 is equal to 3, so it's negative 1 plus or minus 3. So x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus 3 divided by 2. So now we have two answers from here. We can, oopsies, we can assume that the x value, or the value is using the positive of 3, or we can assume that the value is negative for 3. So let's start with the positive. If we're using the positive value, it's going to be negative 1 plus 3, which is 2, divided by 2, which is 1. So x is equal to 1. Or we can assume that we're going to use the negative value. It'll be negative 1 minus 3, which is negative 4, divided by 2, so negative 2. So x is equal to negative 2. And those are the two values of our equation. Let's move on to another one over here. If I can fold this paper for a second. Okay. So we have the equation y is equal to 32x squared minus 7.5x. So we're going to use the quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's determine what our a, b, and c values are. So for a is equal to the coefficient acting upon the x squared term is 32. B, the value acting upon the x term is negative 7.5. And c, we don't have a c term, so the coefficient is 0. C equals 0. So let's set up our quadratic formula. X is equal to negative of b, and b is negative 7.5, negative 7.5, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 7.5 squared, 0.5 squared. As I run out of space, b squared minus 4 times a, which is 32, times c, which is 0. So now this term is going to be 0, so we can just cross it out. And all over 2a, so 2 times 32. So simplifying, negative of negative 7.5, x equals 7.5, plus or minus the square root of 7.5 squared. Let's see what 7.5 squared is. Oopsies. 7.5 squared, 56.25. Oopsies. 56.25. 56.25. And all that is divided by 2 times 32, which we all know is 64. And then we continue. 7.5 plus or minus the square root of 56.25. So let's see the square root of, square root of 56.25 should be 7.5, and it is. So x equals 7.5, 7.5 plus or minus 7.5 divided by 64. So there are two cases we can use. We can use the positive value of 7.5 or the negative value. So if we use the positive value, it's going to be 7.5 plus 7.5, which is 15, divided by 64. So we have x equals 15 over 64, or we could have we could use the negative 7.5 value. 7.5 minus 7.5 is 0, or x is equal to 0. Awesome. So we can always check our work, like we should. So kind of running out of time, but if we are to take the equation 32x squared minus 7.5x, putting onto our graphing calculator, we should see the graph intercept value when x is equal to 0 and x is equal to 15 over 64. So let's see x equals 0. Does that give us a 0 value? And it does. Very good. And what if you use 15 divided by 64? Does that give you a 0 value? Yes, it does. So we did it correctly. Awesome. So just to recap, the quadratic formula is used to solve any equation, quadratic formula or quadratic equation, to see where the graph intercepts the x-axis. We call those the roots. There can be 0, 1, or 2 roots depending on its location on the graph, and those roots will be important later on in life somehow, hopefully. So I hope this helps with your understanding of the quadratic formula, and yes.